Hi everybody, my name's Julia from Bobbins and Buttons. In this tutorial I'm going to cover the spacing, marking and making of the buttonholes for my Lewis top and dress pattern. So I just want to start by saying that I don't include a buttonhole guide in my patterns, and the reason for that is that I find them a little bit inflexible and therefore inaccurate. So I'll explain a bit more about that as I go through showing you how to space and mark the buttonholes. So the first thing I want to mention is interfacing. The pattern does suggest to interface the front facings, and I would recommend it even if you think your fabric is quite stiff and structured. The interfacing will just help give a bit more stability and stop your buttonholes from stretching once you've stitched them, and also a nice base to stitch your buttons onto on the other side. So next, the side in which the buttonholes are made. So traditionally ladies' garments are fastened right over left and men's garments are fastened left over right. So the buttonholes would be made on the right hand side and the buttons stitched on the left hand side as worn. But there's nothing really to stop you doing it the other way around if that's what you prefer. Next, you need to consider whether you're going to mark your buttonholes horizontally or vertically along the front. So with a garment like this you can do either really. If it was a traditional shirt where you have a seam down the side of the buttons, you'd want to mark them vertically so that the buttonhole didn't foul the seam. But with this, it's pretty much a blank canvas, you can do it either way. So there are a couple of things to consider when you're choosing whether to do vertical or horizontal buttonholes. So I've just made a buttonhole up here on a piece of scrap just to show you how the buttons sit in the holes. So with a horizontal buttonhole, the button will pull to the end. So you've got a bit of flexibility with movement with a horizontal buttonhole. Whereas vertically, there's no movement across. The movement would be up and down. So with a garment that's up and down like this, the button is going to sit in the centre of the buttonhole. So now we're going to consider the button spacing. So this is where a buttonhole guide is a little bit inflexible. I've chosen these nice silver buttons, which is the size that I recommend in the pattern. But I just want to show you a couple of different options that would also work really nicely, but would probably throw a button guide out if I'd given you a predetermined spacing. So this button is just a bit bigger, it's probably about 3 or 4 mil bigger, so it would probably still work and still look quite nice, but it might mean that I want to space my buttons a bit further apart if I was using a button that size, but it still would actually work with the amount of button wrap that's allowed on the pattern. We could also do something, these buttons are actually odd, but just to give you the example, you could use very small buttons and create a more decorative feature by doing something like double buttons like that, and again this time you'd be having 2 buttonholes very close together, but it makes quite a nice decorative feature, but using a completely different spacing and size of button. And then again I've got a couple of different shaped buttons here which could work quite nicely. This one's obviously long and thin, so it's about the right width, but again would probably require different spacing. And then this one would also work, but probably require different spacing. So working with the buttons I've chosen, I'm now going to show you how to space them out. So you'll notice that I've got a tacking line running down the front here. So what I've done here is I've basically measured from the pattern the distance between the fold line and the centre front, and I've drawn a chalk line along that line, and then I've gone over that with a tacking stitch partly so that it shows up strongly here on camera, but also it's quite a good idea because it will hold your facing together so nothing's going to move while you're working on your buttonholes. So if you are doing vertical buttonholes, you will be actually making your buttonholes exactly along the centre front line. If you're going to be doing horizontal buttonholes, your buttonholes will start 3mm to the front of that line. So I'm going to be doing my buttonholes horizontally, but I'm going to show you how to mark both vertically and horizontally. But to start with, we want to decide where to put the buttons. So what I like to do to start with is just place them roughly, and then we'll take some measurements. So you'll want one at the very top, and then from there I'm just going to place the buttons to how I think they look appropriate for the top. And then there's a couple of other things that's worth considering at this point. If you're fuller busted, you might want a button at the bust point so that you have a bit of extra security there and you don't get any gaping holes. So say this is my bust point here, that might change my decision where the buttons are going to be spaced. So if that's my bust point, I might want to do this, just space those out a bit, and that's starting to look fairly even. I quite like that spacing. If my bust point was here, then again I might want to take one out there and create spacing. So you can see how you can play around a little bit to create the spacing that's right for you. And likewise at the bottom you might want one that's a bit lower to over your sort of tummy area, so you might want to move your lowest button down. So it's probably worth trying on your top and just sort of deciding on key areas where you want a button before you start doing your spacing. So now that I've got that roughly marked out, I can see they're not perfectly even, so I'm just going to measure and just get a general idea of which is the closest measurement. So let's start here. So I'm measuring from centre to centre, so that's 7.5 centimetres, so is that one. That's nearer 7, that's 7, that's 7, and that's 8. So overall I'd say 7 was about our average. So now I'm going to mark them a little bit more accurately and see how they look. So I'm going to keep that one at the top, move that one up to 7. So like I said, I'm going to the centre of the button. And now they're more accurately marked, I feel that that's a good spacing, so I'm going to stay with my 7. I feel that's going to cover my bust point. I've got one at the top and one's not too high up or too low down at the bottom. So I'm just going to talk through the vertical buttonholes because I'm actually going to make the real buttonholes horizontal, but I'll show you how you would mark the vertical buttonholes. So to start with, I'll bring in my buttonhole that I made earlier. So this buttonhole has been made for this button, so I've got the exact size of how what the buttonhole will measure when it's been made. So if I measure that, that measures 1.5. So to get my first position at the top buttonhole, I'm going to measure into the centre of the button. I want the button to finish around about there, so there's a little bit of edge above the button of the top showing through. So that measures 1 centimetre. So I'm going to start by measuring down 1 centimetre and marking that. So that's the top of the buttonhole, and then the buttonhole will run from that point down the centre front line. So all the buttonholes will be on the centre front line. So I would now go away and make that buttonhole, which is going to finish the 1.5, and then I would measure from the centre of that finished buttonhole to the centre of the next buttonhole. So in this case I can measure that, so that's looking like 6 centimetres, and then half of the button is going to be 0.75, so that's where my next buttonhole starts. So once I've worked this second buttonhole, I can measure the distance between the bottom of that buttonhole and the top of this buttonhole, and that will be my spacing all the way down. So let me just see, it's going to be around about 4 centimetres. So I can measure 4 centimetres after each buttonhole, but I prefer to do the buttonholes one at a time, just in case. It's very easy to slip up with measurements and then you've made the buttonhole, and although they can be unpicked, they're not really fun to unpick. So I just prefer to take them one at a time. So once I've got that spacing from the bottom of that buttonhole to the top of the next, I can use that after I've made each buttonhole until I get to the last one. And again, count how many buttons you've got so that you know how many buttonholes to make. So to measure the horizontal buttonholes is a little bit easier, because we are just going to measure to the centre of each button. So we want the top one to be the same, so we'll measure down 1 centimetre, that's the centre of your button, and then from there we're going for a 7 centimetre spacing. So I'm going to measure from that point, centre point, to the centre point of the next button, and mark that, and centre point of the next button, and carry on all the way down. And then with the front spacing, you want to come 3 mil to the front of the centre front line. So I'm just going to mark that again with a pin. So that you've got your spacing. So what I would do now is, you can either take the pinned work to the machine, or you could transfer these marks with chalk, whichever you find easier really. So I just want to talk through making the actual buttonhole. If you've got a fairly modern machine, you'll probably have a fitment something like this that will do a 1-step buttonhole. If you've got an older machine, you've probably got a 4-step buttonhole. So if that's the case, you're going to need to mark the end of the buttonhole as well as the start. So with a 1-step buttonhole, you only need to mark the starting point, and the rest will be worked out. So this particular buttonhole fitment, which is what most machines have, has a little clamp at the end, so you push your button in and that determines the size. And then you'll just need to set your machine up according to the instructions for how to work the buttonhole. But then the other thing I just want to suggest at this point is that you make a little cross. So if you're going to do it with pins, you'll need to remove the pins, or with chalk, which I find a little bit more accurate. And then place your buttonhole guide over that and make your first buttonhole on a bit of scrap, so that you can see where that lines up to, so that you know where you line your cross up, because basically this has a little red marker across diagonally and horizontally, so I'm matching that up with my chalk cross there, and I just want to check where that starts so that I can determine the right position on the top when I make each buttonhole. So there we go, all the buttonholes are stitched. They're probably a little bit tricky to see, but they've all gone nicely. So one last thing I would like to mention about stitching the buttonholes is when you've set your machine up and you've positioned it to sew your buttonhole, I like to just square everything up. So just check that your centre front is parallel with a line on the sewing machine, and that your foot is going directly back, so that your buttonholes don't go off at any kind of funny angles like that. So just try and follow some grids on your sewing machine to get nice squared buttonholes. So the last thing to do now is to cut the buttonholes and stitch the buttons on. So for cutting the buttonholes, a quick unpick is quite a good little gadget to have. So I like to just pierce the buttonhole in the middle, and then I quite often find a sharp pair of scissors that will just cut the rest of it. That way you've got a little bit more control. But you can also put a pin in at the end of the buttonhole, just in the front of the stitching so that your quick unpick doesn't slide off the end, and then just carry on cutting. There we go. But with the scissors you can get a little bit more control and cut into the ends a little bit more easily, I find. So the scissors do need to be pretty sharp if you're going to cut in with the scissors, but you can just have a little bit more control to get into that end, and then just try your button through the hole and check that it fits, and that's fine. And now the last thing to do is just to sew the buttons on the other side. So again, I've marked the centre front, so your buttons will be stitched along that centre front line. I like to start at the top, just line up your top so the hems and the neckline are level, and stitch the first button onto the centre front underneath that buttonhole, and then I just basically stitch them on individually, checking that they're on the centre front line as I go down. Then if you're 1 mil out at any point or 2 mil and it follows on, you're going to keep it nice and flat as you go along. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, it would be great if you gave it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos, please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.